There are about 1 million prisoners across the continent reportedly living under inhumane conditions. Various African law and justice leaders and human rights organizations across the continent believe that it is time to rethink crime law and incarceration on the continent. So they've converged in Sandton for some discussions and possible solutions this week. Well, joining us now to talk a little bit more about this topic is Deputy Minister of Justice John Jeffery. Deputy Minister, thanks very much for joining us. Good to have you here on the programme.
Good morning, Leanne. Good morning to the viewers.
Deputy Minister, tell us
Thanks for having me.
A pleasure. Thanks for being with us. Tell us a little bit more about this gathering that is taking place currently.
Look, the gathering is a meeting of SADC oversight mechanisms into prisons in the SADC region, which started yesterday, finishes today. I actually wasn't part of that gathering. From South Africa's side, it includes our Judicial Inspectorate of Correctional Services, the National Preventative Mechanism for the Convention Against Torture. But I wasn't part of that gathering. I was part of a function yesterday evening, a photo exhibition on conditions in prison, and very much as part of the campaign to decriminalize poverty.
And so, I mean, when we talk, though, just in general about the conditions, and obviously this was, you know, this was the gathering, so it's kind of the theme that they're talking to, are the conditions that the prisoners on the continent are living under. Let's talk to some of those. What has been highlighted as some of the biggest issues that we're facing?
Well, obviously, and I'll speak more from South Africa's side, we've got serious overcrowding. We don't have enough beds in the prisons. I think it's sometimes, I won't go into those figures. And obviously, a developing country can spend less money on its correctional facilities. When money is spent, there are complaints from the public that why are inmates of correctional facilities getting the opportunity to study, to write matric, to do other courses, most of which they've got to pay for, when ordinary people don't have that opportunity. But the issue really is overcrowding. We've got a serious crime problem in South Africa. The response from the public is for heavier and heavier sentences. So the number of life sentences being served has increased exponentially with the introduction of legislation to ensure minimum sentences. The issues, though, not so much the serious crimes, because obviously those are people who've done something really bad. They need to be removed from society. They need to have some form of punishment. But there's also the issue of rehabilitation. The issue more is the petty offenders who end up in prison when really they shouldn't be there. That they're there because they are poor. They can't afford to pay bail. They can't afford to pay the fine. You know, people will often get a punishment of a term of imprisonment or a fine. The richer people will buy their way out of prison by paying that fine. The poorer people can't, and they go to prison for a short period. And there's not much that can be done for them to rehabilitate them in that short period of time.
Mm. And you touch on such an important point there, because one thinks that going to prison, you know, it's twofold. Obviously, it's punishment for the crime that you have committed, but ultimately it's rehabilitation. And that is one of the major issues facing inmates. And as you say, I mean, this is, let's try and focus very much so on, obviously this whole exhibition and gathering has to do with what's happening on the continent, but our focus right now, I imagine, is on South Africa. The rehabilitation aspect seems to be one that is missing within this sector. What are your thoughts on this? I mean, rehabilitation, is that even something that's possible within our prisons?
Yeah, look, I don't have the statistics with me. As you know, I'm not the Deputy Minister of Correctional Services, but of Justice. But my understanding is that rehabilitation is working relatively well with the longer-term prisoners. That those people who get out on parole for longer sentences, the recidivism, the rate of re-offending rate is relatively low. It's the shorter-term prisoners that are the problem. But that's why also to move the conversation into preventing people from going to prison. So one of the things that was done in the early 2000s was to pass the Child Justice Act, looking at how to deal with children, that's a person under the age of 18, who is in trouble with the law. And obviously the more serious offences, and children can commit serious offences like murder, robbery, rape, but that those would require heavier sentences, but to as far as possible get them out of the criminal justice system so as not to further criminalize them. And so cases get diverted if child undergoes, does certain hours of community service, goes on certain programs, that kind of thing. And I think that's been relatively successful because if you look at children, they're people who are going to be around for a very long time. So you don't want them, as far as possible, in the prisons, being taught how to commit crime better because they're going to be around for some time and society will have to deal with them.
Well, you know, when one does visit a prison, I mean, we went into, I remember a few years back, we went to go and visit a prison in the Western Cape. And I mean, this has to be one of the hardest prisons, as we do know, the maximum security prison out in the Western Cape. And the conditions, Polesmore, thank you. My director just filling in the missing words there, Polesmore. The conditions within there, you know, we were taken through into some of the cells, had a look at the conditions that the prisoners are living in. I mean, sharing beds, having a toilet in the middle of the cell, no walls, nobody can, you know, have any form of privacy. I mean, not that you're going into prison for a better life, but the overriding feeling when you're walking through the prisons in South Africa is that A, they're overcrowded, B, any form of rehabilitation is not going to happen because it's almost like survival of the fittest when you get into a prison. And these are reoffenders that are just being introduced back into society. And this is something that, I mean, I'm looking at a report that was written way back in 1994. And here we sit in 2022 and things have just deteriorated. So, you know, the focus, granted, I know you're not from correctional services, but, you know, I suppose the justice system, correctional services, they do, in a way, hopefully work hand in hand with one another. But I mean, plans in terms of sorting out the prisons, what do you know of any?
Look, obviously an aspect is build more prisons and finding the funds for that. And that would be issues of deciding where to prioritize funds. But I want to go back to the key question of how many people in correctional facilities, and this is the justice element because it's the courts that have sent them there, how many people in those facilities shouldn't be there, are simply there because they're poor. And I'm talking about people who haven't been found guilty yet, who've been given bail. The court has decided that the person can get bail, they can be released, but they can't pay the money. So they sit in custody in prison. And take up beds. There would be the issue, the petty offenders who get sentenced to short terms of imprisonment, which are not really going to reform them. And then there's the people who get sentenced to a term of imprisonment or the option of a fine. If they're rich, they'll pay the fine. If they're poor, they'll go to prison. It's those people that are contributing to the overcrowding, and I think the issue we need to be looking at is should they be there? But let me just say that I think we've got one of the largest prison populations, proportional to population in the world. We can't keep just throwing the people in our society who've done wrong, we can't just keep throwing them into prison and you know, kicking them away out of society. We've got to look at broader societal issues for dealing with crime. The issue of gender-based violence is a serious issue in South Africa. Part of the response has been to tighten sentences for gender-based violence. But the perpetrators of gender-based violence are people in society, somebody's father, somebody's uncle, somebody's son, somebody's grandson. It's society that are producing men that beat up and rape women. So I'm really urging a societal approach. It's not just something for government, it's for society as a whole.
Well, it certainly is, and I mean that it does. That goes without say. That what happens within communities is what molds the future generations, and unfortunately, within society, so crime is so rife, and particularly here in South Africa, it's a daily occurrence that people are subjected to, and that is a major problem that we need to sort out within communities. But let's address the issue. So we've obviously spoken to the overcrowding in prisons, and we know this. I mean, South African prisons, and what I'm gathering from the exhibition and the meeting that's being held here in South Africa, is this is a common occurrence on the continent. However, let's address the awaiting trial prisoners, because that is a major problem. And I mean, I was looking at some statistics in terms of the amount of awaiting trial prisoners in South Africa, and obviously you would know this more than I know, but the numbers we're looking at, so we've got close on 944 or 945,000 prisoners in 123 facilities in the country. Of those, close on 50,000 are awaiting trial. And that, of course, is leading to the overcrowding issue as well. Some have been awaiting trial for years. How do we get rid of that backlog?
Well, as far as the people in correctional facilities, it's ensuring that if they are, I mean, you get bail not as a punishment, you get refused bail not as a punishment, but if you're likely to interfere with witnesses or you're a flight risk. If you get bail, obviously the money you pay is a sort of security for that. But the issue would be people who have relatively low amounts of bail. I mean, during the COVID pandemic, or the height of the COVID pandemic, where we were trying to reduce the numbers of people in correctional facilities because they were more vulnerable to infection, we were monitoring the number of people in awaiting trial with bail, but of amounts of less than 500, 1,000 rand, a large number of people. So the question is sort of really, should they have been, it's the courts, the magistrates who are setting those bail amounts, should they have done that? When I was in practice some time ago, there was a magistrate who felt that you shouldn't, if you're going to give somebody bail, and they give them money or set an amount of money that they should pay, it needed to be over a particular amount. I think then it was maybe 500 rand. But it was no use giving them bail, but setting the amount below that, because if they couldn't pay, they'd go to jail. Anyway, that's the one aspect. So the other aspect then is the problems of the blockages in the system and the delays in the courts, which we are very conscious of, and doing our best to, with all the role players, to ensure that things move faster. But the criminal justice system, the processes are not, unfortunately, particularly efficient. And we need to look at how, without prejudicing the rights of people who are presumed innocent, haven't been found guilty, without prejudicing their rights, that we can have a more streamlined system.
Mm-hmm. I mean, because when you read of these stories that come out of prisons, and it's not about looking for sympathy for prisoners. One can feel that. Whether, I mean, you have to feel some form of sympathy. We understand that a crime has been committed. They are to be punished for the crime they're committing, but it's the rehabilitation and the issue of trying to work offenders back into society so that they can become a part of society. But when you read about the appalling conditions of not obviously the waiting trial prisoners, which you've spoken to, the issues which need to be fixed. We've spoken about this, I don't know how many times, in terms of trying to sort that out. But I mean, just reading some of the testimonies of those that in the awaiting trial section, they say there's only one toilet for 40 of us. Some of us end up urinating in the shower. This causes bad smells because we don't get any cleaning detergents to clean the shower or the toilet. He just said that the smell is unbearable. The situation is so bad. We share single beds. Some of us sleep on the floor. There's no area for non-smokers. It's crowded. There's lice. Some of the people around us are sick. In terms of food, they eat melisi and bread. I don't eat it because this food is not right for, it's right for pigs and not for humans. I just eat the bread that is provided, and it goes on and on and on. Now, when you're living in conditions like that and treated like an animal, you're not coming back into the system and are going to be rehabilitated and somebody that is going to be fit for society. And this is the great worry with our prison system.
Yes, indeed. And if you were talking about awaiting trial prisoners, those are people who have not been found guilty as yet, so they may well be innocent. People often complain about criminals having too many rights, but those rights are for people who have not been convicted yet. Well, prisoners, people sentenced have rights as well, but the right to a fair trial are to a person who is still presumed to be innocent and could be innocent. So yes, it is a serious problem.
All right, well, we have to leave it there for this morning, but Deputy Minister, thanks very much for talking to us. That's the Deputy Minister of Justice, John Jeffery, just talking about prison conditions around South Africa. Well, a meeting is being held of different heads looking into the situation in respective prisons on the continent, but of course we're focusing here on the situation in our prisons here in South Africa. But that being the Deputy Minister of Justice, I wish it was that of the correctional services, so we could actually get some accountability for why our prisons are in the state that they're in.